The apologists that you see on YouTube, they're usually in control. They lead the discussion and they don't brook a lot of dissent. It's really the only way that they survive. Then you get something like this. And oh boy, is this fun to watch. Frank Turek is an idiot, and this is what happens when idiots completely fail. We're going to look at another Q&A session with Frank Turek, but this time with a twist. This time, the normally unflappable Frank Turek meets his match and has to retreat into full fallback mode because I think he realizes just how close he gets to utter disaster, and in front of a paying audience too. This is what ought to happen to every single apologist out there ever. Let's use this as a learning opportunity, because it's time for these morons to go down.
You made a good point, right? When you said you're dispelling science because science is just made by scientists, right? So you can't consider that all true.
Now, there are a couple of ways that this could go, and it can go either really, really well or really, really badly for Frank. I could also predict that all the answers that Frank might give, because Frank is pretty predictable. Once you do this for a while, seeing into the mind of the apologist is pretty simple, if you want to use that word. So where I think it might go badly, and where I hope it does, and remember I haven't seen any of this at all yet, is that this guy says, well then, why trust theologians since religion is just made up by the religious? And of course, Frank will just make up excuses to coddle his religious audience, but this is an absolutely fair point. Religion is just something that the religious invented. Why should we believe any of it? But let's see him get the rest of the question out first, because I think this could be hysterical if done right.
But then my question would be like, couldn't you just flip that back on the Bible? Because the Bible was also written by humans.
Well, it wasn't stated as critically as I might have done it, but good show, sir. Good show. Of course, he's probably a Christian struggling with some of the BS that people like Frank spew, so I guess I wouldn't be surprised if he wound up an atheist, asking impertinent questions like that, but who knows? We'll just have to see. I'm just making a lot of wild guesses here, and I probably ought to stop that. It doesn't necessarily lead to any good ends. However, the question he asked is entirely valid. I don't know about Frank, but I have absolutely seen apologists saying that science can't be trusted because it's all based on human observation. Except we are observing things that, at least as best as we can tell, are objectively real, whereas the religious, aren't. And I don't want to put words in Frank's mouth, though, so let's see what he actually has to say.
No, I'm not saying all science is false. All I'm saying is that science requires scientists in order to exist.
And religion requires believers. What difference does it make? Because I don't have to be a scientist to go out and do science. I can do experiments right now. Well, I guess I could if I wasn't just sitting in front of my computer recording a video. But I could be doing science in about 5 minutes if I really wanted to be. Because that's the thing. Science isn't a belief system. It's a methodology. Anybody can do it with a little bit of knowledge and perhaps a little bit of preparation. No degrees required. Of course, Frank doesn't know that, or at the very least he doesn't want to admit it, because Frank is one of the most dishonest apologists out there. But let's see how he spins it.
If there were no scientists, you wouldn't have science.
Bullshit! Because where did the scientists come from before there was science? You didn't think that one through, did you? Not that Frank thinks about anything deeply anyhow, but this is something that we see from the religious all the time. These people do not think their theology through because a momentary glance at the things that they say proves it's all just a bunch of absurd, ludicrous nonsense. It doesn't make any sense unless you're just running on fee-fees and faith, which is all that Frank and his followers do. He's counting on it. That's how he gets paid.
So people have to interpret the data they're seeing, just like you have to interpret the Bible too.
So then
It still exists, but the question is the scientist interpreting the data properly? That's the question.
And he doesn't ask the same question that I would have. Is the theist interpreting the Bible properly? He doesn't want to get into that because that produces a lot of very uncomfortable questions, and Frank's paycheck is on the line. I've pointed this out in a lot of videos before where the theist will say, well, our interpretation is right. Great. How do you know that? Well, we have faith. Well, so does everybody else. The people that you're saying are wrong, they also have faith that they are right. And in fact, they think that you're wrong because you don't agree with their faith. This is why, because I say so, doesn't mean anything. You have to be able to show, independently of your faith and fee-fees, that you are correct. In science, we can show that. In religion, they absolutely cannot. They can only express their feelings, but their feelings don't matter, do they? Facts don't care about your feelings. This is where these questions start to get dangerous to people like Frank, and where, if it was an obvious atheist at the microphone, he'd be calling for it to be turned off. Because with just the right additional input at the wrong time, this could make everything that Frank says come tumbling down.
So then would you say that like Christianity or the Bible couldn't exist if there weren't humans to interpret it?
Ooh, you're playing with fire there, aren't you, Frank? You keep letting him talk. And of course, Frank will have a standard faith-based BS answer because that's what he does. But this is where you need to point out that faith doesn't matter, and he can't allow that. I find it interesting that he isn't really at a hardcore Christian university. Wingate says it respects a Judeo-Christian heritage, but it accepts people from across all religions and philosophies. So Frank had better be careful. He might wind up looking more like a fool than usual.
Well, if there were no humans, there would be no Christianity, because Christianity involves God coming to earth to save humans, yeah.
Except that's not what was asked, was it? Without humans to interpret anything, would Christianity exist at all? Frank is just assuming that Christianity is true because that's what he really wants to be true. But that doesn't make it true. This is why you can't allow faith to fester in any rational discussion, because you get people dancing around questions like Frank is doing here. This is why this is such a dangerous thing for Frank to entertain. He is a science denier, although not remotely as bad as a lot of others. Getting Stephen Meyer up there and watching him dance around this, that would be absolutely hysterical. However, Frank questions science a lot more than he questions his own faith, and all it takes is someone picking at those threads to make the whole thing come crashing to the ground. Keep picking, my friend. You're doing just fine.
Okay, go ahead.
Even in the sense like
The elements that we study to do science, to find the relationship between cause and effects are there, right? But scientists need to interpret that.
Oh, good. Frank taps out. Now, I don't know who this guy is, and I don't really care, but he too seems to be missing the point. People like Frank are asserting that Christianity is true, at least his particular version thereof. They have no direct observations that they can point to, anything that they can prove is verifiably so, anything that they can use as evidence that their interpretations are reasonable or rational. Science does, though. Science can do all of that. Science can do it over and over and over again, and Frank can't. Frank can just stand up on a stage night after night and make the same kind of lame, empty claims and hope that the people in the audience just open up their wallets. What Frank is doing and what scientists do, those are not remotely the same thing. Not even close.
For example, if we're gonna look at Christianity and the Bible in a parallel way, men still have to interpret, the biblical text, but you will not dismiss that just because men are interpreting the text.
But that's the problem. Those men, by and large, since I don't want to generalize for everyone, but they are claiming that they have the one true, absolutely perfect, God-ordained interpretation that cannot possibly be wrong, so there. Well, how do we know that? How do we know anything about the validity of the interpretation or about the Bible in the first place? Because it's all based on faith, not fact, and there's no way to verify that anything that these people are saying is actually true. That's the difference between science and theology. You can verify science. You can't get remotely close for theology. Now, you might not have the training or the knowledge or the information immediately at hand to solve high-level physics problems, but you can absolutely get them if you really wanted to. You may not have the education, but you could get it. You could go back to school. You could read books. You could learn this stuff. For religion, you can't do any of that. It's all just, well, here's what I believe. But what you believe doesn't matter. What you're doing in religion isn't what you're doing in science. It wouldn't be somebody telling you about the experiments. It would be you going out and demonstrably doing the experiment yourself, making the actual observation and having other people make the same observations in their own experiments to corroborate your own. Because that's the thing about science. It's repeatable. It's testable. You can verify the results on your own if you care to put in the time and effort to try. With religion, you can't do that because there are no experiments to run. It's all faith and fee-fees. And that's why it's so stupid.
In other words, you still have to engage in interpretation. The question is, the million-dollar question is, are you making the right interpretation?
And that's what we're asking. Do you have the right interpretation, and how do you know? How do you prove to me that you do? Because in pretty much all situations, science can show that. They can trot out the objectively verifiable evidence and walk you through it. Religion can't do that. All they have are stories in a book of mythology. Now, they really want those stories to be true, but there's a huge difference between wanting something to be true and being able to prove that it is. There's a massive difference between my book says a thing and hard evidence. And the religious don't have any of the latter. That's kind of the problem.
That's why we have to be careful thinkers. And Charles, that's why I love people like you that are inquisitive when it comes to things like this, because what is it? Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living.
Now, you notice how Frank is just standing there hanging his head in shame, right? He doesn't know how to handle it, and this other guy isn't doing a very good job either. See, what I think happened here is that Frank had no real sway over the guy at the microphone. The other guy on stage, he does, at least I'm assuming so. He's trying to diffuse what could have been a very nasty situation for Frank, mostly because I think he knows the questioner. He's part of the faculty, I think, and he's hoping, and I'm just kind of guessing here because I don't know how to get into his head, but I'd say he's hoping that being an authority figure at the college, he can just make this guy shut up before he exposes Frank's whole game. Now me, I wouldn't have put up with it, but then again, I have nothing to lose by just pushing my luck. The student, presumably, since he's wearing a Wingate shirt, he probably does have a lot to lose if he goes too far. So let's see how this wraps up.
We have to do that. We have to engage in conversation about things that make us uncomfortable. It makes us think.
Which is exactly why Frank ran for the hills. He doesn't want to think. He never thinks. You don't adopt that posture if you're confident of your own position. This is essentially Frank curling up into a fetal position. He doesn't know what to do, which is why he handed the reins over to somebody else whose word carries a little bit more weight than his. Now, I have no idea why he even put this video on his channel, since he essentially got his ass handed to him, but who knows what goes on in the mind of Frank Turek? Probably not a lot.
And for the God question, look for the terminology of aseity with self-existence. Is very, very fun to look into stuff like that.
When in doubt, change the subject. Because you notice what never actually happened in this video, right? They didn't actually address the question that was asked. This is a big distraction because they didn't have any real answers. Frank sent up an SOS and this guy tried to wing it, but it wasn't remotely impressive at all, right? I mean, I went through this video again with the sound turned off just to watch Frank's body language. You can tell exactly where he started to get uncomfortable. Everything that he's doing is entirely defensive and scared because he almost got outed in front of a paying audience. Honestly, that question or one very similar needs to come up in every single Q&A session that Frank ever has from here out to the end of his career. I can think of other questions that would have had the same effect, where Frank wouldn't have answers, and this is why we need to take it to the apologists instead of just letting them blather on unchallenged. It's why you don't respect the stupid. You don't even pretend. Respect is earned, it's not just granted, and the apologists are hoping that everyone's going to just sit idly by and listen because they happen to be up on a stage with a microphone, ostensibly in control. Do not let them get away with it. Now, don't disrupt the presentation or anything, but if they ask for questions, make sure you got a couple of zingers and do not let them off the hook. This was proof that these morons can be shaken, and that needs to happen constantly because these people are just con men, and that needs to stop.